Russia's Gazprom said it could restart gas shipments through Ukrainian pipelines to Europe if an agreement can be reached to let an EU-led monitoring mission to begin tracking the flow of gas in Ukraine. Russia stopped gas deliveries through Ukraine on Wednesday as its pricing dispute with Kiev escalated. The halt in gas supplies has left several European nations struggling to cope during a harsh winter. At least 11 people have frozen to death. To analyze what lies beneath the dispute, The Real News spoke to political economist and author William Engdahl in Frankfurt.
The latest conflict between Russia and Ukraine on price fixing for the 2009 transit and consumption of natural gas from Russian gas fields through Ukraine has a long history, but it goes back really to the Soviet Union when Ukraine was integrally part of the Soviet economy together with Russia, and there was no thought of borders between the two countries. The pipeline system that was built from the Siberian gas fields, the largest gas fields in the world, by the way, that led through Eastern Europe and to Western Europe, to Germany especially, and France and Italy, other countries in the West. Those pipelines, 80% of the gas coming today from Siberia, which is Western Europe's largest supplier of gas, come through Ukraine. Now, to understand what's going on with this seemingly Laurel and Hardy kind of drama between Gazprom of Russia and the state-owned gas company in Ukraine over prices for the 2009 period and payment of an alleged $2 billion of back debts to Gazprom from Ukraine's side, you have to go back to 2004 when Washington handpicked person as president of Ukraine in what was called the Orange Revolution. It was backed to the hilt by the U.S. State Department, National Endowment for Democracy, the usual array of so-called human rights organizations that created the international publicity drumbeat for this Orange Revolution. And the candidate of the Orange Revolution was Viktor Yushchenko, whose wife, actually at that time she was an American and had been an official in the White House as well as the National Security Council and State Department. And Yushchenko came in pledging Ukraine to join NATO. So to understand this conflict, this seemingly trivial conflict over an increase in the price to Western market prices, which is what Russia's demanding for the gas that goes through Ukraine, the Ukrainian gas has been subsidized by Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, partly as a political gesture to try to keep Ukraine in a friendly fold, at the same time that Washington was trying to pull Ukraine into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this is part of a bigger picture of the encirclement geopolitically of Russia since the end of the Cold War by NATO and by Washington most especially. So the demand of the U.S. to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, which was tabled indefinitely, some people here in Europe in the NATO circles say that it's been put off the table for at least 20 years after the madcap adventures of Saakashvili, president of Georgia, back in August, leading this invasion of South Ossetia. The inclusion of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO would present Russia with a de facto life and death threatening situation militarily, and that's precisely, it appears, what NATO is after. And the U.S. has been in negotiation with Yushchenko's presidency in Ukraine over potential stationing of U.S. anti-missile defenses in Ukraine, as well as talks on the same subject in Georgia. Now, if you just look at a map of Eurasia and look at where Ukraine and Georgia stand in relation to Russia, you'll realize that the missile fly time from Ukraine to any place inside Russia is one of minutes and not of hours, as it would be from the United States. So this kind of inclusion into NATO is really the hidden agenda of these natural gas talks. I think the reasoning from the side of Yushchenko, and I can't imagine he's doing this without prompting from the State Department and U.S. officials, that Yushchenko sees by forcing a false flare-up between Russia and Ukraine over gas prices, they can try to cut off the gas supplies that go through Ukraine. 80% of West European gas goes through Ukrainian pipelines. They can cut off those supplies and then try to blame Russia for being adamant when in fact it's a commercial dispute that the Ukraine has literally decided to bring to a head in order to gain geopolitical influence with the West. So the more they can drive a wedge between Russia and Western Europe, just as the aim was with the Georgia invasion of Ossetia and the Russian response to drive a wedge between Russia and Western Europe, the more that they can create this strategy of tension, which some people in NATO find the ideal agenda for conduct of U.S. foreign policy. The former defense secretary of the Bush administration, Robert Gates, is a carryover into the new administration that takes office on the 20th of January. Doesn't give one great optimism. Gates is on record adamantly supporting the anti-missile defense, which is a highly provocative military deployment that enables the U.S. to launch a nuclear first strike for the first time since the 50s. So the climate is building up in a way that I think is a geopolitical confrontation that will be on the table of the new Obama presidency early on if some people in Ukraine don't come to their senses and cut a compromise with Moscow on this gas. I think in the next couple of days there's enormous pressure from the European Union to cool this thing down. Russia has no interest in having gas supplies threatened as it was in 2006 when Ukraine cut off the gas to Western Europe in a similar dispute and then blamed it on Russia so that everyone could say Russia is an unreliable gas supplier. So Russia really has no interest in that, but they definitely are in financial difficulties with the collapse of the oil price, and natural gas prices are linked to oil. So Russia's under, and Gazprom in particular, is under strong pressure to increase their revenue flows. Ukraine virtually is a failed state at this point in time. They have no effective government. The opposition held parliamentary hearings in the summer where they demonstrated that Yushchenko, as president, signed off on illegal arms transfers to Georgia, including vital arms for the defense of Ukraine, and then the money never ended up in the state treasury. It ended up perhaps in someone's private Swiss bank accounts, but the parliament couldn't track that down. So I think this is part of a whole series of pinprick provocations that we're going to see between Ukraine and Georgia, especially since the December NATO ministers' meeting put the Georgia and Ukraine membership into NATO into the far, far distant future. So the people in Washington who want this Ukraine provocation are probably going to try these kinds of pinprick provocations. They're going to threaten the Russian naval stationing Sevastopol, which is in Crimea, that used to, until 1950s, it used to be part of Russia. There are all sorts of little areas of friction that are being built up here. So I don't see a dramatic escalation. Perhaps the gas thing will be settled in the next days, but then there will be another provocation that will rear its head, I'm sure, in the next months.